Aha! We finally appear to be live. This is good news. Dave, thank you so much for that. It's good to know that I'm on here. Okay, we're just getting a few things set up here, a few last second details. This is new software and we're trying to make it happen. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me on tonight's webinar. I want to point out to you that if you have questions, you can post them to the open thread on the Sailing and Cruising Cuba Facebook page, and that link is noted at the bottom of your screen. If bandwidth permits, I'll get to your questions in about 10 minutes and continue until I've answered all of them. Basically, what's happening in Cuba now is the more things change, the more they remain the same. The new Cuba regulations are now out, and contrary to what the naysayers have to say, they're not nearly as draconian as we had feared. Most travel to Cuba will continue to be permitted. What I'm going to discuss tonight is my own personal first take on the new regulations after having read the announcements and other information that's been made available by the Treasury. As always, things are going to change as the new rules go into practice and as they are interpreted by the officials on the ground. I will be following this issue, and I will update you as more information becomes available on the Sailing and Cruising Cuba Facebook page. Note particularly, if you have made a financial commitment regarding travel to Cuba prior to President Trump's announcement on June the 16th, 2017, if you made a hotel booking, a Casa Particulara booking, if you've organized a charter boat, etc., you'll be able to travel under the old rules. Lucky you. The big change in the rules is that the individual mandate, as it pertains to the people-to-people travel, is gone. What that means is that you can no longer self-declare as being compliant with the regulations and then just take off to Cuba for a vacation. Anyone being honest about the situation is going to admit the individual mandate was being abused in any event. American tourism is not permitted to Cuba. It's going to take an act of Congress for that to change, but that's what was actually happening in most cases. However, of the 12 permitted categories for travel to Cuba, 9 of them remain unaffected. The 3 that have been changed are the people-to-people individual trips, non-academic, in other words, individual educational trips to Cuba, and the support for the Cuban people categories. Among those other categories, for example, those with close Cuban relatives or people involved with sanctioned sports-related travel such as a regatta held under the appropriate organizational auspices, they can still travel to Cuba as previously. The big question for American cruisers is, how does all of this affect your plans to go to Cuba? There are 2 aspects involved. The first is the permission you require for yourself and your American crew, and the second is the authorization you require for your boat, which you get via the United States Coast Guard Form 3300. In general, you can no longer say you're going under the people-to-people category and then just cast off the lines for Havana. Nor can you go as an individual under the educational category. To qualify under either of these 2 categories, you must now go as a member of an authorized group, with the United States representative of that group accompanying you. That clearly leaves the door open for charter companies such as Harmony Yacht Vacations, who were the organizer of last year's epic Cruising World Rally to Havana. Harmony offers these kinds of tours in compliance with the regulations, and that of course includes having one of their representatives travel with the tour. I'm already aware of one such charter type trip in 2018 in which people will travel on their own boats, and I'm sure that more will be organized as people come to understand how these rules work. According to Margie Matheson of Harmony Yacht Vacations, we do groups, so it won't change much for us at all. It will push people to go with an authorized organization such as ours. It remains to be seen what other hoops we'll have to jump through, but we are prepared. I myself personally brought a rally group of 7 boats to Cuba with Harmony in 2016, and everyone loved the experience. But despite the many benefits, group trips don't appeal to all cruisers. So what can you do to get to Cuba on your own? There appears to be an opportunity for American cruisers who wish to visit Cuba on their own. It is still possible, according to the regulations, as I read them, to travel as an individual under the Support for Cuban People category. Essentially, this is the category in which you might bring sporting supplies to Cuba, or educational materials, or participate, for example, in rebuilding a school in Cuba, or working in a sailing regatta in Cuba. To qualify for this category, you must have a full-time schedule of activities that, quote, support contact with the Cuban people, support civil society in Cuba, or promote the Cuban people's independence. Full-time means that you are busy with activities that are congruent with your reason for being in Cuba. I reached out to the United States Coast Guard officer in charge of this aspect of Cuba travel as it pertains to boaters today. He advises me that they need to more fully study the new regulations before offering advice. What that means is that you're going to have to wait and see how the authorities handle things going forward. Interestingly enough, dining at a Cuban home restaurant known as a paladar, or staying at a casa particulara, which is analogous to our bed and breakfast, or taking a cab, all count towards support for the Cuban people. So also do interactions with other Cuban entrepreneurs such as cab drivers, but you will need to do more than just these activities to qualify. For example, you could be involved with a group of people in assisting in building a school or rebuilding a school. Whatever it is, I believe that it will have to be substantive in nature enough to justify getting permission to travel on your own. I believe that as people turn towards this category to justify individual travel to Cuba, the rules will be interpreted by the administration to determine just what is permissible and what is not. At this point, rather than suggest you travel to Cuba with 500 baseball bats to give away to Cuban sports teams, as one cruiser I know did, I will direct you to section 740.21 of the Export Administration Regulations. That's 740.21 of the Export Administration Regulations. This outlines what regulations apply. From that point, your own imagination and creativity are going to have to direct you. According to Pedro Ferreira, a Miami lawyer who specializes in Cuban legal issues, he thinks that there will be, if you look at the guidance, some fundamental things. A traveler must stay at a casa particulara. Not that he must, but that certainly helps. There are, of course, Cuban hotels that are acceptable. They're not all on the forbidden list, and I'll come into that in a minute. They could stay at a casa particulara. They could eat at paladares. They could engage with Cuban private merchants, buying souvenirs, for example, a taxi driver, or buy cell phone services, purchase things from people selling souvenirs in shops, as I mentioned. In other words, engage with the private sector. This is what the U.S. government wants to promote. The regulations are clear that that's not going to be enough, however. A traveler will need to go beyond these basics and have significant engagement in things such as fostering independence from the Cuban government, or to show significant exchanges with Cuban people. You will need to show that you have a full-time schedule of pertinent activities. In any event, you still, as cruisers, we still have to get permission for your boat to be in Cuba, and that requires the United States Coast Guard Form 3300. In order to get this form, you'll have to provide your qualifying reason to travel to Cuba, and this is where I see the rules being enforced for we cruisers. If your reason is not good enough, you won't get the 3300 to travel on your own boat. The other big change is that Americans will be prohibited from dealing with businesses in Cuba that are connected with the military. This includes many hotels, restaurants, and several marinas on the north coast, which include the port of entry Puerto Vita on the northeast coast, Guillermo in the central north coast, and Marina Gaviota in Veradero, as well as several more on the south coast. Now, for most Americans traveling to Cuba, those are not particularly important marinas other than Gaviota. The others, most Americans are typically not going to get to. Hemingway, which is not owned by Gaviota and thus is not owned by the military, is spared. You can still go to Marina Hemingway. That is definite. A complete list of prohibited businesses can be found online at www.s3.amazonaws.com/ oh, it's too long. I'll post it for you later, folks. This list will be subject to revisions and additions. As we move ahead, the U.S. government will be finding other locations that they may feel need to be added to this group. Brad Matheson, also of Harmony Yacht Vacations, states that these restrictions will change the entire dynamic of visiting Cuba for his company, as his company has used many of these places on the forbidden list in the past for group travel. Some charter companies outside of the marine industry report that the changes won't affect them at all. So, in all honesty, it depends on the individual business how they will be affected by the restricted list. If they utilized military-owned businesses in the past, they'll have to change that practice now. But nobody sees that as being a particularly difficult shift to make, because there are a lot of businesses in Cuba that are not directly owned by the military. Both Brad Matheson and I anticipate that the regulations will be more strictly enforced than in the recent past, that itineraries will be more closely reviewed before travel is approved, and that those returning from Cuba will have to retain records of their itineraries and expenses. Now, as in the past, that is expected, and those will be subject to review, but this was a rule not previously enforced. I would expect that to change, and that could be where the most danger lies for people who travel to Cuba. Just this afternoon, for example, a few hours ago, I got the following post from a friend. Quote, "So, I'm offshore on a boat in the Straits of Florida. The Coast Guard is flying a C-130 in the Straits and asking folks for their CG3300 number." That's what's happening this afternoon, right now, according to somebody who is sailing in the Straits of Florida as you and I chat here. The Coast Guard, he continues, the Coast Guard is patrolling the Straits, asking folks the standard questions. Name of vessel, number of persons, last port and where bound. I heard a response of Marina Hemingway in one case, so the plane asked for their 3300 number, which they gave. I only passed the word because we all know those who are just going to go anyway. Now, folks, this is not something that we had happening before. I've never heard of this kind of patrolling of boats in the Straits on boats going to Cuba. Clearly, things are changing already, and you need to be aware of these changes if you're going to go to Cuba. In my own opinion, your best and safest way to now travel to Cuba on your boat will be with a group charter or with a group that is organized as part of a permissible educational setup. Since there is no restriction on how you travel to Cuba, you can fly there, you can go on your own boat. Both are allowable. One of the issues that will be affected, however, will be the insurance one. It's been challenging enough to get boat insurance for Cuba, and I suspect it will be that much more difficult still with the new regulations, and that creates an entirely new element of risk for cruisers traveling there. Whatever you do, I strongly suggest you keep a log of your activities in Cuba and be very accurate with it. Keep receipts and take photos so you can prove where you've been and what you've done and who you did it with. I have already seen bad advice being given out on this issue by people who should know better, and I strongly suggest that you wait and see how the U.S. government handles boaters who go to Cuba under the new regulations. Things are changing, and I think they're changing significantly in terms of enforcement. And this government wants to show that it is policing these new regulations. That probably means that if you get stopped, you're going to get the full treatment, whatever that turns out to be. This isn't something where you want to be made an example of and risk losing your boat or getting hit with a huge fine. On the bright side, if you do manage to cruise to Cuba legally, you can still bring back as much rum and as many cigars as you wish. And if you are bringing back rum, my favorite is the legendary Elixir. Please don't forget me. Okay, let's see what we have in the way of questions. Bear with me while I check the Facebook page for this. Okay, John Ahern. No problem with watching Dancing in the Stars at 8 o'clock. It's nowhere near that at this point. You'll have lots of time to get back for Dancing on the Stars. Okay, Kurt, you asked, can I get a Coast Guard 3300 trip permit? Kurt, provided you qualify under the rules, you will be able to get a Coast Guard 3300 trip permit to go to Cuba. Bear in mind that permit only gives you 2 weeks in Cuba if you qualify for it. A third question from Perry. Assuming I can still sail and visit the country, what marinas do you recommend and what do they cost? Well, that's kind of an easy question, Perry. The only marina on the North Coast that you can go to stay at is going to be Marina Hemingway in Havana, which is probably the one that you wanted to go to. The other North Coast marinas are now off limits, and you're not going to be able to use them. You can clear in, for example, you can clear in at Gaviota, but you can't stay there. You could clear in, for example, at Puerto Vita on the northeast coast, but again, you're not under U.S. regulations allowed to stay there. For those reasons, it makes those places fairly pointless to go to. Now, let's see if we have any other questions coming in here. We'll have to refresh here, won't we? Done. Let's see. Nope, that's it for the moment, folks. If there are any other questions, you can post them on the Sailing and Cruising Cuba Facebook page, and I'll be more than happy to answer them there. This webinar will be online on YouTube in a couple of days once I've had a chance to edit it. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. I do hope you'll get a chance to go to Cuba. It is an amazing and fascinating country. The people are wonderful. The scenery is something else. It's an entirely different world. If you get the chance to go to Cuba, whether on your own or with a charter group, I highly recommend you go to it. And for sure, disfrute. Folks, thank you very much. I appreciate your having joined me tonight. And as I said, if you have questions, join us on Sailing and Cruising Cuba on Facebook, and I'll try to answer them there. Thanks very much, and good night.